For the first quarter of the 21st century, one man has loomed large consistently over the global political stage.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
This consistency has little to do with democratic practices and popular support. Instead, it is a function of a ruthless and decisive exercise of power. To his detractors, Putin is a thug and dictator, a gangster and a warlord. To his supporters, he is the chosen one, redirecting Mother Russia's broken legacy into greatness once more. But who is he really? Is he a ruthless dictator crushing his people? A new czar lording over a system of vassalage? Or is he a strategic genius who has single-handedly checkmated the moves of the world's biggest imperialists time and time again? Hi, this is Last Man Thinking, where we discuss geopolitics and history from all over the world. And today we're going to be talking about Vladimir Putin and try to answer these questions and answer one more query. Is Putin the most consequential leader so far of the 21st century? To understand Putin the man and his outsized role on global politics today, we need to start at the very beginning. Childhood and adolescence are periods that shape us tremendously, and a lot of what we do in later life stems from there. So let's start at the very beginning to try and understand Putin. Vladimir Putin was born on the 7th of October 1952 in Leningrad in the Soviet Union. His mother was a factory worker and his father had served in the Soviet Navy during the Second World War. His parents had lost a previous son in the war, allegedly due to starvation during the siege of Leningrad. And these and other stories, no doubt, made a young Volodya, as his parents called him, dimly aware of the great cataclysm his nation had barely survived just a few years before his birth. Putin's family condition was basic, even Spartan. He grew up in a somewhat tough neighborhood, often getting into skirmishes with other boys in the Soviet-designed blocks. Somewhat small for his age, he learnt early to stand up and assert himself through becoming a capable enough fighter to hold his own. In the unofficial Soviet caste system, kids from Putin's background were not really supposed to amount to much. Many drifted into a life of crime with the underworld, which again didn't officially exist in the Soviet Union. As he grew up, always having been an indifferent student, a young Putin began more and more to hang out with disreputable gangs and people who it was quite obvious were going to end up in Soviet jail. He was headed for a life of crime, but here again he seems to have realized that he needed to take charge of his destiny and to seek something better. Putin's first break came when he started practicing Sambo, a martial art, and thus seemed to have found a way out of the criminality that his future otherwise promised. Though he maintained some contacts with his more unruly comrades, eventually he would get good enough at Sambo for his coaches to predict a bright future as a sportsman. Yet Putin seemed to want to aim higher. And here we get a glimpse of the ambition that drives Putin. Instead of focusing on the easiest available path, he, a nobody from the communist dumps of Leningrad, dared to try and reach for something else. As a young man and upcoming athlete, he first set his mind to becoming a pilot. And despite rising in the ranks of Sambo, he was soon on his way to fulfilling this dream, with the position being all but available to him for pilot training, thanks in no small part because of the contacts he had made through his local martial arts exposure. But these were the heady days when Soviet TV was broadcasting homemade spy thrillers like The Shield and the Sword and 17 Moments of Spring, which showed dashing KGB agents combating Nazi and Western spies. Something clicked in young Volodya, and without telling anyone, he decided that the KGB would make a good career for him. The Leningrad law facility, where Putin would have to go to pursue a career in the KGB, was one of the Soviet Union's most prestigious educational institutes, comparable to the Ivy League or Oxford. When others in his circle finally learned what he intended to do, they called him mad. His father was furious that his son would risk so much rather than working towards the assured comfort of being a pilot. And his coaches were aghast that he was willing to let go of a promising, possibly international career in martial arts. Many of his friends till date maintain that had he concentrated on Sambo and Judo, which he had also started, he could have become a high level international athlete, even a champion. But once Putin had decided, he followed a principle he had absorbed right from his first childhood brawls all the way through his Sambo training. If you want to win a fight, you have to carry it through to the end, as if it were the most decisive battle of your life. He cut back on Sambo and concentrated on subjects which he'd need for the law facility entrance exam. Universities also made allowances for gifted athletes, and due to whatever combination of reasons, when the list of acceptable candidates was put up, Putin's name was there. University wouldn't be easy, but Putin would see it through. Along the way, he would make new contacts, like his professor Anatoly Sobchak, who would later play a major role in Putin's early political career. He filed away these contacts along with the others he had made in his life, right alongside the ones he had first made as a would-be ruffian, and also those he had subsequently established during his Sambo career. This was fast becoming another critical aspect of his personality, and remains so to this day. Putin knows people and often forms close personal associations with useful men and women. They in turn are also rewarded and helped out by him. Another aspect of his personality started to emerge in this period. Slowly, the impulsive and indisciplined boy began to give way to a man who kept his emotions to himself, only letting go in very rare circumstances. This too remains with Putin today. After a few postings within the USSR, Putin, by now an established KGB operative, would be posted in Dresden, Germany, and would spend many years there, taking forward the secret efforts of the Soviet Union to win the Cold War. And the KGB would teach Vladimir Putin new things. How to get things done, for example, how to get things done no matter the means. False flag operations, misinformation campaigns, all of this Vladimir Putin would learn from the KGB. And of course, like all secret services, the KGB undoubtedly gave him some lessons in paranoia. A young Putin had learned to keep his cards close to his chest. The KGB taught him how to conceal his real motives underneath a rice mask. All this can still be discerned in Putin's character today. By now, he was married, he had 2 daughters, and he lived a comfortable and steady existence in a dacha in East Germany. The young would-be ruffian from Leningrad had come a long way. Yet, within the Soviet sphere, he had reached about as high as he could. He was a cog in the vast machine that was the USSR, and perhaps would have remained so if suddenly that whole machine had not collapsed. So the reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed, the dramas that ensured that it would not survive, these are not the subject of this video. But suffice to say, it wasn't a great time for ordinary Russians. Having achieved so much, Putin now found, like millions of other Russians, his whole carefully constructed life crumbling along with any certainties about the future. Returning to Russia, Putin found the situation had deteriorated tremendously. Crime, long hidden away by Soviet propaganda, was surging. So was alcoholism. The collapse of the Soviet state had suddenly also unleashed hordes of new political ambitions. Still a member of the KGB, it is unclear of how he got involved in the chaotic politics of the day, whether being ordered to infiltrate the new emerging movements or on his own violation. But Putin would soon find himself working alongside his old professor Anatoly Sobchak, now an upcoming figure in Leningrad politics. In this new emerging political free-for-all, chaos was the rule. None of the people vying madly for power had any idea about how to govern, of how to run things. For Sobchak, a man like Putin was invaluable. Someone who could navigate the Byzantine labyrinth of a collapsing Soviet system and get things done. Slowly, quietly keeping his hand hidden. Putin would navigate this maze and strengthen his position, while publicly deferring to Sobchak, carrying his briefcase around, personally guarding him during uncertain times, all the time slowly making new contact, like a young Dmitry Medvedev, slowly sidelining rivals, slowly making himself indispensable. In the West and the wider world, this period, the 90s, are often seen as a golden age. The Cold War had been won, markets were booming, the old social fault lines of race and gender seemed to have been papered over, and the US and its allies were now completely in charge of the destiny of the planet, ready to take it forward into a new and bold future of freedom and prosperity. In contrast, the Russian experience was horrible. Chaos and anarchy ruled, crime and corruption ballooned, nothing worked, and people starved on the streets. In the Third World, the term Russian went from meaning something aspirational to a crude synonym for prostitute. A false nostalgia began to be constructed in Russian society at this time, where the gulags and repression were forgotten, and only the free schools and holidays were dreamt of. Even today, like this recent poll shows, up to 66% of Russians experience nostalgia for the USSR. Like many Russians, it would not be too much to think that Putin too was deeply disturbed by this change. Take a look at this clip. It shows a future President Putin standing next to an East German born Angela Merkel, watching a military band in Germany perform the Soviet national anthem. Putin, the man who keeps his emotions hidden, is clearly moved and can only hide his feelings with some difficulty. Perhaps it is a simple nostalgia of the time when he had built a simpler and more certain life in this very land. In another instance, in 2005, he would say this in a speech.
Прежде всего следует признать, и об этом я уже говорил, что крушение Советского Союза было крупнейшей геополитической катастрофой века.
Clearly, in Putin's mind, as in the minds of many Russians, this viewpoint has a great deal of resonance. It would go on to form a huge pillar of his future politics, one that we can see fully on display today when it has morphed into a full-blown official ideology. Putin learned new lessons even as he steadfastly applied the old ones he honestly knew. How to navigate corruption, how to utilize agreements with others to further his ambitions, how to play politics in a fractured and near lawless state. His patience and hard work would pay off. By 1994, he was deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, the renamed Leningrad of his childhood. Others had also played this game in the crumbling Soviet Union. A certain Boris Yeltsin had used a similar opportunism to vault himself into the presidency of the new truncated nation of Russia. He too had navigated backroom deals and probably made many corrupt bargains to get power. Putin would come to his attention, and just like once Anatoly Sobchak had found Putin to be useful, now Yeltsin would see merit in a man who could get things done, and above all, a man who valued personal relationships and could be trusted to uphold a bargain once struck. In 1998, Yeltsin would make Putin the head of the FSB, the rebranded KGB of old. Putin moved quickly, applying both old and new lessons learned. He consolidated power, suppressed dissent, controlled information, and reinforced state security. There was now on display something else that Putin seems to have picked up during these chaotic times: a new ruthlessness in achieving his goals. Already, people who asked too many questions, posed problems with journalistic investigations, were beginning to have accidents. What Putin's role in all this was is still hotly debated, but he and those he served certainly benefited from these incidents. By 1999, Putin was first deputy prime minister, and Yeltsin had begun to speak of him as a successor. Putin began to construct his public image, presenting a good with law and order image alongside vociferously demanding action against Chechen separatists who had been trying to break away from Moscow's grip. On 31st December 1999, Yeltsin resigned and Putin became acting president of the Russian Federation. The first decree he signed on that last day of the 20th century guaranteed safety from prosecution for Yeltsin and his family. In return, Putin got Russia. As Yeltsin left, he supposedly turned to Putin and said, "Take care of Russia." Young Volodya, a cipher for most of the world's media at this point, a nobody who had suddenly, it seemed, appeared out of nowhere, seems to have taken that statement as part of the bargain that he had struck. Personal power to be repaid by national rejuvenation. And with his usual efficiency and determination, he set about doing just that. Trying to replicate foreign models in the 90s had not worked. Russia would have to find its own path, combining the principles of a market economy and democracy with Russian realities. In public, he began to cultivate his no-nonsense tough guy image, an image most ordinary Russians, sick of the chaos of Yeltsin in the 90s, could relate to. Mere hours after becoming president, he was already flying out to meet the Russian troops fighting the Chechen separatists. Russian TV would interrupt its New Year programming to show the new leader interacting with the troops and handing out medals. After years of hopelessness and decline, many Russians began to feel that this simple, straightforward, self-made man from the tenements of Soviet Leningrad might just be the man Russia needed. The military was to play a big role in his plans, starting right away in Chechnya. Here, Putin's ruthlessness would come fully to the fore. Grozny, the Chechen capital, would be flattened, and Russian troops would be merciless in their recapture of the Islamic breakaway province. This would also be his first run-in with the West. Russia would be severely criticized for its indiscriminate use of force. For Putin, this was utter hypocrisy. The US and its allies had engaged in the dismemberment of Yugoslavia for the past decade, and their ineffectual interference had done nothing to solve that crisis. They had bombed civilians too, yet when Russia was doing the same in order to prevent secession, Putin and his country were pilloried. From a few stray remarks he made at the time, one gets the feeling that the West, absorbed at this moment in its hegemonic domination, and completely unable to understand the psyche of that young lad from Leningrad who had held his own against all would-be dominators, that West made an enemy in Putin. The victory in Chechnya offered another addition to Putin's evolving playbook. Success in war was great for domestic popularity. It also gave him cover to tighten his grip on institutions and the levers of power. It allowed him to suppress Russia's press. It gave him power to wipe out dissent. He had already used his old lesson, the one about personal relationships, to rejig Russian politics and state apparatus to be loyal to him personally. Slowly, he would also cut to size Russia's oligarchs, the new billionaires who had risen in the chaos of the 90s. Putin wanted to rebuild Russia, and to do that, he wanted total centralized control. All the major trajectories of Putin's 25 years in power were already here. Foreign wars to serve international and domestic political efforts, growing repression and control over every aspect of the country, and a hostility against the perceived double standards of the West. All this was to be wrapped up in a propagandistic shell of patriotism and a belief in Russia's greatness. Putinism, as it were, had arrived. At the moment, he kept the West at arm's length, though. Putin kept the rice mask on and said all the right nothings that the US and NATO wanted to hear, and carried out, sometimes quietly and in the shadows, the agenda he had set for himself and for Russia. But this would not last for long. In 2008, a more confident Putin would take on the West's effort to absorb the post-Soviet state of Georgia into the EU and NATO sphere. In his conversations with then Georgian President Saakashvili, his disdain for the US and its allies would be made plain.
They are really very hard, strong statements, and he said lots of paper was spent on the statements. So he told me, Mikhail Nikolaevich, why don't you call your friends in the West and tell them to roll this paper and stick it in their asset?
The war would get Russia some breakaway territories and completely throw Georgia's pro-Western plans out of orbit. Putin would once again thwart the West in 2014, this time in Ukraine, annexing the Crimean Peninsula and starting a proxy war within its eastern territories. In a remarkable clandestine operation where little green men, soldiers with no discernible insignia, would capture Ukrainian territory at lightning speed, while also allowing Russia and Putin some level of plausible deniability. While the West rushed to push sanctions, Putin was already on his next big military mission. He would deepen ties with China and Iran, again displaying that fabled expertise in personal relationship building and finding the right people for the job. His equation with Xi Jinping would eventually blossom into an alliance in all but name, and he would build a working and close partnership with Iranian Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani. And in 2015, he would intervene in the Syrian civil war to prop up his ally, Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. While he would gain some acclaim for fighting against terrorists of the Islamic State, the Russians would use the same indiscriminate bombing and scorched earth tactics that they had first shown in Chechnya. All this was being done alongside increased central control being established. Political and other opponents routinely began to suffer accidental shootings and poisonings. The oligarchs were nearly totally eliminated, and election after election turned up Putin as the winner, often by greater and greater margins. By the early 2020s, Putin was fully in control. Russia was no longer a chaotically dysfunctional nation, and the West had finally woken up to the fact that they now had an effective and calculating enemy in Vladimir Putin. In 2022, Putin would launch the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This war, of course, is still on. Things haven't gone according to plan for Putin, but he's still in it, showing no signs of backing off, shrugging off hundreds of thousands of young Russian deaths with his now characteristic ruthlessness. And so, this brings us to the present day and our few questions. So now that we've taken a look at where Putin comes from, can we answer those questions we asked at the beginning of the video? Who is Vladimir Putin? Is he a ruthless dictator oppressing his people? Well, he certainly is ruthless, and he keeps winning elections against opponents who never show up, so I guess he's a dictator too. Like other dictators, he seems to have done quite well for himself too. Rumored to have many palatial properties, he wears expensive watches and clothes, lives and eats in the style of the billionaires he once berated, and, according to some analysts, is believed to even be the richest individual on earth. Is he a modern day Tsar? Well, right after his victory in Chechnya, Putin set up an authoritarian system in Chechnya under the sublet dictatorship of the Kadyrov family. That was quite medieval. He also controls Russia not through some structured power system, but through personal loyalties, through people who owe him fealty. And this again is quite medieval. He patronizes certain institutions in the Russian system, like the Orthodox Russian Church. Again, very imperial. Calling him a modern day Tsar might not be as anachronistic as it seems. But unlike a Tsar born to the throne, he isn't blue-blooded. More like a usurper or an opportunistic conqueror. Like a Napoleon or a Hyder Ali. He understands his people because he was once of them. If he is a Tsar, he is the first of his line, put on the throne not by his family's blood, but by his own red hands. And is he a strategic genius? Well, there is no doubt that he's certainly an effective leader. He has, in some very important respects, rebuilt Russian state and national power, though often at the great expense of the freedoms of the Russian peoples. he still also seems to have that young ruffian or the upcoming Sambo champ's ability to honestly look into his opponent's eyes and judge frankly where he stands before plotting his move. Slowly, of course, as is evident by his missteps in Ukraine, this ability to keep his ear to the ground is fading as decades of power undoubtedly built taller walls between him and ordinary reality. Yet even now, even compared to many democratic contemporaries, it seems Putin is able to channel that young man who dreamed of joining the KGB or the silent briefcase carrier biding his time and refocus on his situation to try and hammer it into something he can work with. He still keeps his cards hidden, he still cultivates his contacts, he still sees every fight as his most decisive battle, and he still shares with the vast majority of the Russian peoples a deep nostalgia for a time when their country was great and admired. And yes, he uses all these abilities to keep himself and his friends and his supporters in power. So, strategic genius? Maybe not. But certainly he is an effective leader. And what of the most consequential leader of the 21st century? Is Putin the most consequential leader of the 21st century so far? Why? Because he launched a few wars? Well, many people have done that. George W. Bush and Tony Blair launched a devastating war against Iraq. Bibi Netanyahu has launched war after war, and he's been around in politics for as long as, if not longer than Putin. So what makes Putin stand out? Well, to answer this question, we have to look at the political philosophy that Putin has built brick by brick through his lived life experiences. The experience of a young Volodya standing up to his bullies, the experience of an upcoming Sambo champion using the Sambo mat to get beyond what has been bequeathed to him, the experience of a young man who has great opportunities laid out in front of him, yet chooses to reach higher, chooses to join the KGB, for example. Then the perseverance of a backroom phone dialer, working the contacts that he has carefully cultivated over the many years, publicly carrying briefcases and such. And finally, to an unsure new president of a devastated country, hobnobbing with the people who, behind their smiles, hope to dismember his country. All of this together gets a political philosophy going, which one might call Putinism. And this is a template today for people to gain and to maintain power. Gone is the West's starry-eyed vision of a bright future shaped by a just global domination. Now even Americans want to be great again. The hallowed past is back in vogue everywhere, as are Putin's tried and tested methods of using conflicts as a cover for all sorts of curtailment of public freedoms. From Trump to Orban to disparate Le Pens and Farages of the West, a clear imitation of Putin's politics, once isolated and alone, now seems to have spread across the globe. When Xi Jinping became leader of China, he chose not to be like his immediate predecessors and instead leaned into becoming an Oriental Putin. Leaders across the world seem to see in Putin a format to follow to achieve and maintain power. This may be bad news for those of us who are used to living with democratic freedoms, but it is a clearly observable global trend. And this is why, when future historians look back, they will call the first 25 years of the 21st century the Age of Putin. Ultimately, though Putin is a man, and like all men, one day he shall pass and his age will end. Or perhaps he's going to be around for 100 more years, who knows. So, thank you for watching if you watched this far. If you like our content, please like and subscribe. Press that bell icon to let you know when our next video is out. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.